All right, we're going to stick with college football and talk about those Hokies. Should the fans be satisfied for beating UVA for the 10th straight year, but not making the ACC Championship game this season?
Well, perhaps satisfied is the wrong word, but I've said it a lot leading up to this, and I pretty firmly believe that had the Hokies made the ACC Championship game, despite still losing 4 games and some very bad losses in there to boot, I really think that would have been more of a net negative for this program than a net positive. You know, obviously, there's always the chance that they could go on to beat the Seminoles. They do have a good defense that could give a young quarterback trouble, but that is all just so atmospherically unlikely that I just think that more than anything, it would have rewarded the coaching staff for a lot of the thinking that they've always had, which is setting their sights on an AC title, no matter how many losses we have or how bad they are. If we win our division and get to the ACC Championship game, we can stamp this season as a success. And you heard Frank Beamer a little bit after the UVA game already sort of hedging in that direction, saying, well, for all these injuries, for all these things that we had to endure, to still come out with 8 wins is really encouraging for me. And I just think that that's really indicative of the things that are wrong with the program, and a trip to the ACC Championship game when I think a team like Duke is more deserving to go simply because of the quality of the wins that they've had and the things that David Cutcliffe had done with inferior talent. I think that would have been not a step back necessarily, but an unfair reward.
Well, you're in the school of thought of a lot of the fans last year who wanted the 10-week streak, the 10-win streak to end because it kind of served as this beacon of inferiority to the rest of college football's great teams, and I understand that for sure. My thing, I think it's always great to get the ACC Championship game. I don't think there's ever a bad time for that to happen to a program. But no, I think that Duke was definitely more deserving. But it's also interesting to look at this Hokie team and say, what if they didn't play Alabama the first game of the season? What if they played a nobody? What if they played, a mid-major kind of team and
another
won?
Directional Carolina?
Yeah, exactly. What if they did? And they're 9-3. Does that change your feeling about the season at all?
No, not really. I mean, honestly, I loved that Alabama game. Not only was that more national press than they've gotten in some time, but it also, they went out there and put up a fight about it. And people still refer to the fact that Alabama, for as good as they were, had one of their worst games ever against that Tech defense, even though Logan Thomas just completed 5 passes and just looked like a train wreck. That still left an impression in people's minds. I think that was a positive. And what I really like is that there were a lot of reports that said that ESPN offered Tech the chance to not play Alabama in, I think, August, pretty close leading up to it. And Frank Beamer said, no thanks, we're in the game, we'd like to stay in the game. And I like that. But you're right, it's a totally different picture if they don't.
Yeah, and my other thing about this team is the fact that you have to look at, this year is not a failure with the coaching staff because it's a new coaching staff for the most part. It's a new scheme, specifically on offense, obviously. And I think you have to let those guys recruit and those guys get their own people in and get their scheme in during the spring, which I know they had the opportunity to last year, but all the way leading up, spring practices, summer practices, what have you. And I think that's when we can start to judge this team. It ends up being a little bit of an unfair advantage for the senior class because a lot of negative things end up being put upon them. But a lot of times it's hard. When you change staffs and schemes like that, it's really difficult. So I also think you have to think about it that way, that this team did a lot of good with sort of a tough draw.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but at the same time, this was a very senior-heavy team, particularly on defense, not so much on offense. But on defense, you had a core coming back that I think played exceptionally for long periods of time, and were often, they certainly had their slip-ups, their miscues, allowing 122 yards on the ground to C.J. Brown being chief among them. But the offense certainly did them no favors, and whether that's a function of their inexperience of the new coaching staff, when you look at the quality of opponents that they played, it's a little inexcusable. And quite frankly, to throw those 4 interceptions against Duke, you can say all you want about how well the Blue Devils have played this year, but when you look at that game, that is a game the Hokies should have won, plain and simple, and that changes the narrative 180 degrees. Now, no longer are the Blue Devils, they'd be maybe a footnote, they'd be a nice story, but they've changed from being maybe in a couple of years Cutcliffe can get these guys going, into Virginia Tech winning the Coastal again. And that is solely on the offense, and when you look at the quality of teams that they've played, I don't think that you can just say, it's a rebuilding year. And it's a rebuilding year, but look at the competition. Next year is going to be sort of a similar situation. You're going to have Ohio State, but other than that, it's not a very difficult ACC slate. So I feel like we're going to be talking about the same thing next year if we get a job afterward, of course.
But I do think it's important that they beat UVA for the 10th straight year.
Oh,
I think it's extremely important because if you lose this game, that senior class is going down as one of the most embarrassing finishes to a season of all time.
It's bad enough to lose your senior day at home, but they do have the distinction of going 4-0 against UVA over their time here. 5-0 if you want to count a guy like Logan who said, I was on the travel squad, I was there for the whole time. I'm willing to give that much to him. If that's his legacy, that he broke all these records somehow and never lost to UVA, well, you could certainly do worse.
What are people going to think? I'm sorry, I know we got to move on, but what are people going to think, like 30 years down the line,
That's gonna
if
be a
you're a
head-scratcher.
Hokie fan, when you're coming in and you look at that? I don't know, it's going to be odd.
Yeah, that's going to be a hard one to explain to the kids.